I want to just take a moment again to thank Joyce Maynard for that thought-provoking and I think very brave keynote last evening. We will see more of her over the next day and a half. It's important, I think, here at the beginning to acknowledge that many of our collections once performed and indeed still perform a memorializing function. Historically, our libraries and museums were repositories for the records of accomplished individuals. And part of the tremendous power our institutions wield rests in their beatifying function. The notion that our collections are not so much monuments but research collections is a much more recent development, one closely aligned, of course, with the post-war growth in higher education in this country and abroad. It's important to acknowledge that our history has sometimes been a history of veneration, of venerating the past rather than interrogating it. How we perceive this cultural work has a profound impact on the nature of our responsibilities to those whose records we hold, to those we serve in the present, and to future generations who, I can guarantee you, will look on our own professional practices from an entirely new perspective. It's easy, of course, to see the ethical shortcomings in those who have come before us. What's harder to see is how we may be failing to fulfill our own responsibilities to one another in the present. It was not too long ago when some were not welcome in our rare book rooms, when our institutions privilege, and when our predecessors served as gatekeepers to our collections. The embrace, as the profession has, the embrace of teaching in many of our institutions has helped to dispel some of these more archaic practices. And increasingly, we have, as a profession, lowered, in many ways, barriers to access. At the same time, important work has been done by our professional associations, by SAA and RBMS and the American Alliance of Museums, among other organizations. Each has adopted codes of ethics that have led to a greater consistency in the administration of our research libraries and museums, and I want to acknowledge that important work. But while many of our institutions have reconceived who we serve, we have been less successful diversifying who we are, that is, our own professional ranks. And at the same time, our museums and libraries are filled with legacy collections that reflect the cultural values and the biases of another time. One of our institution's most valuable features, their very permanence, also makes them resistant to change. And I'm speaking to you today from a research library where the foundational collections were acquired before the gains of the civil rights movement, before strides in women's rights, and before more recent progress in recognizing the dignity of all, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. Because our collections grow incrementally in an additive manner, the underlying character of our collections is inherently slow to change. And one only needs to look at the 2 rows of portrait busts that you walked past in our own lobby to see the long tail of the Ransom Center's own past collecting practices. Nevertheless, over the last couple of years, we have, as we know, been part of a widespread reevaluation of historical memory. And many of our campuses, including this one, have seen, to cite just one example, Confederate monuments come down. Some of them transferred to a different interpretive context, as was done on this campus. No longer, in other words, monuments, but instead objects of study. The movements for civil and human rights over the last half of the 20th century and their more recent manifestations, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or the movement for LGBT rights, these movements reframe our responsibilities in meaningful ways. The Me Too movement has helped us look with fresh perspective on sexual harassment and assault in the workplace and beyond, and raised long overdue questions about the role of our cultural institutions in honoring the memory of perpetrators of such behavior and violence. Last night, Joyce Maynard, of course, spoke about her own relationship with the celebrated novelist J.D. Salinger and the fight over her own letters, which was, as we know, more importantly, a fight over her own story. I suspect most of us are here today because we are impatient. But impatient for what exactly? This symposium has been planned as an opportunity to talk about what more ethical institutions might look like. It's been organized around a series of issues, including the global movement of and trade in cultural property, changing attitudes toward historical figures represented in our institutions' collections, and our responsibilities to legacy collections that may no longer align with institutional priorities. The symposium will ask how our libraries and museums can responsibly collect, curate, conserve, and provide access to records of oppression, hate, and violence. And we will discuss ways to remedy exclusionary collecting practices in the past. We've framed this symposium as a series of moderated conversations, and there will be ample time for each of you, the audience, to participate. This is particularly important since the ethical norms that many of us wish to elevate are in fact socially constructed. And the good news that I have to share is we have it within our grasp to be part of the redefinition of more ethical practices in our home institutions, wherever that may be, and indeed in the broader cultural community. This Flair Symposium has been endowed by the late Fleur Coles with additional support provided by the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation. We're grateful to those sponsors for their generous support, and grateful as well to each of you for your interest in and commitment to creating a more ethical and just research library and museum community. I want to thank my colleagues who are helping with the many logistics of this two-day symposium, especially Dr. Danielle Siegler, who I hope is in the room, not in the room. Danielle Siegler, who coordinates our scholarly programs, and without whom none of this could have been pulled together. Danielle is at the back door. Let's give her a round of applause. So a welcome to you all. We are going to proceed directly to the first panel, and I will invite those panelists to the stage and give them brief introductions, and we will begin with their opening statements in just a moment. Please come on to the stage if you would. So you have in your program, you have full biographies of all the program speakers, and so I won't give fulsome introductions, but let me briefly identify our speakers this morning. Dr. Chris Fletcher is keeper of special collections at the Bodleian Library. I'm delighted to say that Chris has had a long association with the Ransom Center and served at one time as a consulting curator for a modernism exhibition, Make It New, a number of years ago. Delighted to have Chris back. Teresa Polk is head of digital initiatives and Post-CustodialArchivist at UT's very renowned LLILAS Benson Latin American Collection, which this year celebrates its 100th anniversary. And Shaun Quimby in the middle is director of Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I'm going to go alphabetical and ask each of them to make an opening statement of about 10 to 12 minutes, and after their opening statements, a presentation of a particular case study I'll lead off with some questions. We'll have some conversation here, but we also want to hear from you, and I'll be happy to call on the audience during that question and answer period. But we'll begin with Dr. Chris Fletcher.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's wonderful to be back here, and thank you also to everyone who's helped bring me over and helped to organise this, and in particular, Danielle. So, at the Bodleian, we've been collecting for over 400 years. Some of our practices back in the early 1600s look different ethically to those today, I hope. And when I was thinking about what to talk about, we have a lot to choose from. One author came to mind, Brian Aldous, best known for his science fiction writing, and an author whose reputation and critical reception is perhaps stronger in the States than in the UK. So why aren't his papers here, for example? Oxford is a city very important to him. He regarded himself as a local lad, and so his papers came to us. Now, Brian Aldous wrote a lot of stories. My favourite is one in which a cockroach awakes to discover he's Franz Kafka. He called it Betamorphosis. Well, I'm not going to talk any more about Brian Aldous, but I am going to talk about Franz Kafka. The Bodleian holds the majority of Kafka's papers, including Metamorphosis. Now, you, along with many other people, might be forgiven for not knowing this. The fact has been camouflaged, particularly recently, by the widespread coverage of a book, a very well reviewed and received book by Benjamin Ballant called Kafka's Last Trial. This book tells the long and protracted story of a legal battle to claim ownership of the archive of Kafka's friend and editor Max Brod. Max Brod was a fellow student with Kafka. He became his editor and keeper of the flame, a not inconsiderable writer in his own right. Now, Brods died in 1968, and on his death, his archive, which contained quite a number of Kafka manuscripts, things that Kafka had given him, letters sent to him, passed into the hands of his secretary and then his secretary's daughters. It has long been contentious. Brod's will expressed a wish that the papers go to some public archive. That didn't happen. And two institutions very much wanted to stake a claim to these papers. One was the National Library of Israel, and the other was the Deutsche Literature Archive in Marbach in Germany, which I'll refer to as the DLA going forwards. Brod had settled in Tel Aviv, and the Israelis considered the Jewish Kafka their man. His Nashlas was, in their view, their cultural property. The Germans regarded him, he wrote almost entirely in German, as one of the greatest German writers and one of the great international writers. Kafka, of course, had instructed Brod, shortly before he died of tuberculosis in 1924, to burn all of his papers. This Brod did not do. Well, eventually, 2015, 2016, the Supreme Court in Israel assigned the papers to the National Library. The question is, where does Kafka, this most enigmatic, placeless, and universal writer, actually belong? Well, in many respects, Oxford. And this is, I promised I wouldn't use the term Kafkaesque in this talk, but there you go, I just have. But there really isn't the time to go into the manifold twists and turns of the story. But the Kafka manuscripts in Brod's own archive, not the only manuscripts of Kafka that Brod looked after. He had many other manuscripts, letters, diaries, and journals of Kafka, and then belonging to Kafka's descendants. Initially, his 4 sisters, all of whom died under the Nazi regime, and then from them to his nieces. It's an extraordinary story. Brod fled Prague on the last train out before the Nazis invaded in 1939. He moved to Tel Aviv and later placed a number of the papers in Switzerland for safekeeping. So these papers were kept by Brod, and in the 1950s and 60s, through the good agency of the family and an Oxford academic, Malcolm Paisley, the papers came to the Bodleian on loan, many of them from Switzerland in a small Fiat car driven through icy Europe by Malcolm Paisley. And the family wanted the papers to be somewhere safe, and Paisley wanted to produce a first critical edition. Now, over the years, a proportion of the ownership of the papers has been bequeathed to the Bodleian by Kafka's nieces. We don't own a full share. We own a 2/3 share in the papers, with a 1/3 share still belonging to Kafka's descendants. Now, as though this was not complicated enough, in 2011, a particular group of letters, still owned by the family, which in fact had been on deposit with us for some period of time, were put up for sale by auction in Germany. These were Kafka's letters to his favourite sister, Ottla, an absolutely remarkable woman. Brave, fascinating, and there she is on the right of Kafka himself. Now, as you can imagine, there was a great deal of interest in the sale of these papers. We wanted them very badly, and the DLA wanted them very badly, probably other people too. Each institution wanted more than anything to prevent the papers from being broken up, dispersed, going into private hands, perhaps. Neither institution had the funds to go after them alone. At this point, the family gave both the DLA and the Bodleian an opportunity to acquire them in a private sale. And so our German colleagues and we decided to purchase them jointly. And this we did. We each raised funds in different ways and were able to get the sum required. This was in 2011. Each institution owns the material indivisibly. Each has a right to a 50% possession during any 1 year. And subsequently, each has displayed these letters and given scholarly access to them. Each has digital images, which are also shared. We have aspirations to do that more publicly than we do at the moment. And interestingly, this joint acquisition has stimulated all sorts of further, wider collaboration. In 2014, each institution and the University of Strasbourg had exhibitions commemorating the First World War, and we each lent elements of our collections to one another. Centenary of Kafka's death in 2024, we want to do something jointly, perhaps an exhibition. And in fact, these conversations have very recently also involved the National Library of Israel. So I think coming out of some of this contested territory has been some very constructive interinstitutional dialogue and a strong will to work together. So just by way of conclusion, this arrangement is not entirely easy. There are all sorts of practical challenges, location, insurance, how the things are described, where do people get information, which institution, so on and so forth. But overall, it's been highly positive. And for an author who, in a sense, belongs to everyone, sharing has proven a way out of tribulation, or, dare I say it, trial. Thank you very much. I neglected just going through just one or two more cards. This is Kafka to Ottler, scenes from his life, and there you can see on the left he's sunbathing. This is a postcard to his brother-in-law, and I was told this is slow. And Lake Garda, postcard to Ottler. No, thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Good. Sorry, tend to be a little soft-spoken, so always good to check. My name is Teresa Polk, and I am Head of Digital Initiatives and Post-Custodial Archivist at LLILAS Benson, Latin American Studies and Collections here at the University of Texas. And I am really excited and honored to be here as part of this conversation, and really looking forward to seeing where these conversations go over the next couple of days. But in addressing the question before us today in this panel, where does a collection belong? I want to start by describing one of our projects at LLILAS Benson that is very close to my heart personally, but I hope will help illuminate some broader questions, challenges, and aspirations. So in July of 2005, an explosion took place in a former munitions depot located in a civilian neighborhood in Guatemala City. In its aftermath, the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman went in to investigate and make sure the area was safe. But what they found was monumental, both figuratively and literally. An enormous trove of documents, piled floor to ceiling, room after room, estimated at some 80 million pages, that were determined to be records of the former Guatemala National Police. The Guatemalan National Police had been disbanded about a decade before, in 1996, as part of the terms of the peace accords that ended Guatemala's brutal armed internal conflict. They had been an integral part of the Guatemalan state's repressive infrastructure during the conflict, and were deeply implicated in violations of human rights, from instances of forced disappearance, extrajudicial execution, and torture. However, it had been presumed that any documentary evidence of their involvement in these actions or events had long been destroyed to prevent any possibility of prosecution or accountability in the wake of the war. And yet here it was, 80 million documents, pages and pages of evidence, comprised hundreds of thousands of identification cards, license plates, photographs, police logs, but also loose files on kidnappings, murders, and assassinations. For the families of the detained and disappeared, many of whom had been taken at the hands of the National Police, who never learned what happened to their loved ones, the possibility of answers, of any real information at all that those documents symbolized, I can't overstate the sense of hope and of heartbreak of what those records meant. That collection became known as the Historical Archive of the Guatemalan National Police, commonly known as the AHPN. Dedicated staff, many of them survivors or family members of victims of state-sponsored violence, have been working since 2005 to preserve, digitize, and catalog the collection. Currently, about 20 million documents have been digitized, and that has focused on the period from 1975 to 85, which represented the height of the conflict. From the first moments of its uncovering in 2005, there was always a sense of urgency, of impermanence even, around the work at the archive, that it could disappear at any moment. That sense was heightened in late 2010 when Otto Perez Molina, a former general implicated in human rights violations during the conflict, was elected president of Guatemala. There was a quite reasonable fear that something could happen to the collection, that the archive could be closed, or worse yet, the documents destroyed. So in January 2011, the University of Texas formalized a partnership with the AHPN, agreeing to maintain a secured duplicate copy of the digitized files and to create an online access point for the collection. We launched the digital archive of the AHPN in December 2011, at the time incorporating nearly 10 million records. In the first 72 hours following the site launch in 2011, the digital archive received more than 10,000 page views. As of 2019, that number has surpassed 1 million. And I can tell you what people are looking for is names. They're looking for the names of victims, of family members. I was actually working in Guatemala in 2005 when the AHPN collection surfaced. I was working as part of an international project supporting human rights organizations, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. The discovery of the AHPN is why I pursued a career as an archivist, and is why I am here at UT. I can't tell you what a privilege it is to be able to work and support this material. Since its discovery, documentation from the collection has been used in 14 legal cases prosecuting violations of human rights. It has played a critical role in Guatemala's post-conflict reckoning with the past, and has supported cutting-edge scholarship on the mechanisms of state repression. The collection represents the largest single repository of documents ever made available to human rights researchers and investigators. The AHPN, as a collection, has a significance that is fundamentally and painfully local, but it also has a significance that is global in scope, symbolically, legally, historically, academically, but I would say also archivally, which is to say that beyond the legal impact of specific records, beyond the historical insight that they offer into systems of repression, beyond its symbolic value as a site of historical memory, the AHPN, alongside other work that Benson has done with other human rights collections, such as the Genocide Archive of Rwanda, has really forced us to rethink our role as an archival institution, and fundamentally for this conversation this morning, to decenter the question of custodianship. Collaborations with both the Genocide Archive of Rwanda and the AHPN developed based on a recognition that human rights documentation can be extremely vulnerable to social, political, and environmental threats, given the very specific nature of its content. And as a university, the academic research value of these collections is very clear in terms of understanding how mass atrocity happens and the short and long-term impacts on affected communities. But it was also very clear very early on that these collections have profound importance to the local communities whose histories they represent, and that bringing these types of materials to Texas for safekeeping, no matter how good our intentions, would have severely negative implications for those communities' access to their own history and memory, let alone larger societal processes concerning transitional justice and reconciliation. So let me be clear that physically acquiring these collections was never an option. So instead, LLILAS Benson has been working to develop a different approach to preserving and providing access to vulnerable human rights documentation, specifically in the Latin American region, based in post-custodial archival theory. For us, that has meant rather than physically taking custody of partners' collections and bringing them to Texas, that we build local capacity to preserve, arrange, describe, and digitize collections locally on site. With the support of the Mellon Foundation, we have been able to partner with archives in Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Guatemala, providing them equipment and training to conduct digitization, developing workflows in collaboration with our partners that are appropriate to their needs and contexts. Here we offer long-term digital preservation for files that have been digitized, and we've built an online platform to provide access to these collection materials. But at the same time, it is our partners who select what collections to be digitized. They establish their own priorities. And since they conduct the digitization and collection of metadata, they retain physical, intellectual, and legal control over their own materials. For communities and organizations that have been marginalized or victims of violations to their human rights, we believe that this control over the access, description, and even physical corpus of their own historical memory is fundamental. And just to close, I think this responds to one piece of the question of belonging, but there's also the other side of the coin, which is, sure, but why here? Why should our institution invest resources in this? And, make some high-minded arguments about common good and global citizenship and the responsibilities that come with privilege, which I think are all true. But I also think it very concretely matters to our local campus community, to our students, faculty, and staff who see themselves or don't see themselves represented in the collection decisions that we make or don't make. As archivists and more broadly information professionals, we don't work in a vacuum. And apologies to decades of archival theory and practice, or maybe not. We aren't unbiased, and we aren't objective. There are really good reasons for these communities and organizations not to trust us with their documentation. From the geopolitical level, given historical relations between the U.S. and Latin America, and U.S. intervention in the region, to our role as information professionals, given on the one hand cultural appropriation of cultural heritage, and on the other, and I'll borrow from archival theorist Michelle Caswell here, to the symbolic annihilation of marginalized communities through their absence or misrepresentation in the archival record. I can't overemphasize how important creating a more representative, more just, and more participatory historical record is. It's important to our students here to see their lives and histories represented and valued. It's important to our scholars whose analytical work is hamstrung if they only have access to dominant or elite perspectives on historical events. And hopefully it goes without saying how important this is for us as a society. And I think all of this points to not simply a need to collect more diverse materials, but to think critically about how the mechanisms of how we do that, to think more critically about the mechanisms of how we do that, and to seek to find more respectful, more participatory, more liberative practices, rather than replicating structures of marginalization and misrepresentation. And that I'll close and turn it over to the next.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for the invitation to speak today, and to Danielle and all of the folks here who made well, everything except my connection in Houston, really seamless. It was great. So my name is Shaun Quimby. I'm the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University. And I'm going to talk today about Allen Ginsberg. In 1993, some 25 years after depositing them with Columbia University, Allen Ginsberg sold his personal papers to Stanford. The remarks that I'll give today recount this tale while probing it for some lessons on the ethics of cultural stewardship. I want to point out that you are the first audience to see this photograph of Allen's matriculation at Columbia in 1943. It had been subject to a 75-year restriction, so that's kind of exciting. He looks so young. We'll begin not in 1943, though, but in 1968, a year marked by global upheaval. That April, Columbia University students rebelled, occupying buildings and clashing with police. On the steps of Low Library, at the very center of Columbia's campus, students and members of the local community joined to voice dissent over the university's plan to build a gymnasium in Harlem's Morningside Park, the Vietnam War, and a litany of other things. The former host of NPR's All Things Considered, Robert Siegel, I guarantee you'd recognize the voice, was then a student broadcaster for WKCR and described a scene that included Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and Allen Ginsberg, who, according to Siegel, gave FCC regulations something of a workout. Ginsberg, of course, had long since graduated from Columbia and was now living a world away in the East Village. His relationship with his alma mater had been a complex one. According to biographer Michael Schumacher, Columbia was a sometimes stultifying intellectual foil to the, quote, Gnostic curiosities offered by his circle of friends that included Jack Kerouac, Lucien Carr, and especially William Burroughs. And yet, by any measure, the university had been remarkably patient with Ginsberg during his tumultuous undergraduate days. Professors Lionel Trilling and Mark Van Doren, towering public intellectuals in the post-war era, offered steady encouragement, and the university's administration even lobbied to spare him jail time in 1949 when he was arrested for his connection to a drug gang. Instead, they recommended that he be sent to Columbia Presbyterian Psychiatric Institute. All right. By November of '68, however, campus had settled down, and Ginsberg wrote a letter, copied to Trilling, to Assistant Library Director Charles Mixer, asking if Columbia would be willing to provide a home to his archive. Quote, circumstances of life and politics in the Lower East Side, he writes, suggest removal of valuables to some place more secure. He provides an inventory of names, Kerouac, Burroughs, Corso, Creeley, etc., hinting that he was aware of the archive's financial value. He was also aware that a certain institution in Austin, Texas, was busily acquiring literary archives. He points out that, quote, various collections of letters from me have been sold over the last few years, most of them landing at the University of Texas. It wasn't my business, and it's okay by me, but that's far away. It's just that Texas pays a lot of money. He goes on to say that he doesn't want to sell his archive now. Rather, quote, I intend to sell them eventually when there's need for money for the poetic community or for myself in distress. At the moment, and for the next few years, there seems to be no need. Given the present unsettled state of the nation, I have no idea what time will bring, comfort, jail, exile, or charming afternoons on farms. He's writing this letter from a farm in upstate New York. In any case, I want to put my papers somewhere safe in New York. For his part, Mixer was interested, noting to Vice President David Truman that although it's general practice to avoid deposits, Ginsberg's status made it worthwhile. He quotes Trilling, who rather lukewarmly noted that, at best, Ginsberg is a good poet. More to the point, he's a contemporary personage who is sure to be studied and written about. Thus began a relationship with Columbia's Rare Book and Manuscript Library that lasted 25 years. I'll note here that we have no signed deposit agreement on file. Only the aforementioned memorandum that stipulates a 10-year term, gives Columbia the right of first refusal in a sale, and allows for public access on a case-by-case basis subject to Ginsberg's approval. This last bit would come to define Columbia's relationship with Ginsberg over the decades as a rich correspondence developed between my predecessor, Ken Loth, and Ginsberg. who would write from various locations, often on city lights postcards, to say that so-and-so has permission to consult his papers. On one occasion, Ginsberg acted as his own agent, as he did in June of '74, when he begrudgingly offered a block of letters for $12,000, noting, quote, "I have difficulty giving up ownership for an amount that I could make on a tour." These are some examples of the postcards that were sent. Might take some time to make sense of the handwriting here. As early as 1969, Gotham Book Mart owner Andreas Brown wrote to Loff, identifying himself as an agent advisor to Ginsberg. At the same time, Brown, along with other dealers, including Peter Howard and Marguerite Kahn, had begun to offer Beat materials for sale, prompting Loff to commit Columbia to more fully documenting the Beat movement. A separate Ginsberg Collection, which Columbia owned, was established and then began to grow. But Loff, meanwhile, continued to field a steady barrage of requests for access to the deposited material. So many, in fact, that it's remarkable that he had time to do anything else. Then our collection file falls silent, in the early 90s especially. Permission requests continued, but generally not with Ginsberg directly, and they lacked the familiarity and warmth exemplified by the earlier correspondence with Loff. And then this. The Times coverage detailing Stanford's purchase of the deposited collection was harsh, questioning why a poet so identified with the urban avant-garde would choose to sell his archive to a place, quote, so ex-urban it's called the farm, balmy, palmy, Stanford University. Ginsberg himself admitted that he would have been happier if it had remained at Columbia or in the Berg Collection at the New York Public Library. But he drew some solace, he confessed, from the fact that it may prove a tonic to an institution known for hosting the ultra-conservative Hoover Institution. There is some evidence of damage control in our collection file. Here's what we tell the press types of memos, but I found no record that Columbia made an offer. And so I put a call into Andreas Brown, who now happens to be living 2 blocks from Butler Library. Who knew, right? By 1993, he told me he was no longer representing Ginsberg. The sale, as had been reported in the press, was managed by Ginsberg's agent, Andrew, a.k.a. the Jackal Wiley. And so I reached out to Wiley, who somewhat surprisingly responded within minutes. Yes, the archive had been offered first to Columbia. Yes, Columbia had made an offer. He even told me what Columbia offered. I won't disclose that, but let's just say it was minuscule compared to what Stanford paid at $1 million. And no, he had no idea if Stanford had ever reached out to Columbia as a courtesy. And so after all of these investigations, I'm left with these thoughts. First, it was not unethical for Ginsberg to sell his papers to Stanford, even when they had resided so long at Columbia. He'd been clear from the outset that his intent was to monetize them someday. This is not to say that I support what's become an acquisition industry, with a few well-heeled institutions paying top dollar for archives of mostly well-heeled, mostly white men. Rather, it's only to say that we at Columbia should have known what we were getting ourselves into. Second, Stanford has been a careful and devoted steward of the Ginsberg archive. Some of you know that I began my career there. I was very pleased to hear Rebecca Wingfield, curator at Stanford, speak at the Bibliography Among the Disciplines conference a few years back on how she'd integrated the digitized recordings of Ginsberg reading Howl over time into the undergraduate instruction program. I mention this because this symposium is about ethical stewardship and not just ethical acquisition, although my case study focuses mainly on acquisition. And third, just as there are gaps in our Ginsberg collection file, I might argue that there are gaps in the codes of ethics that inform our work as cultural stewards. The ACRL RBMS code speaks to individuals more than it does to institutions. The SAA code is a bit more helpful in this regard, even incorporating statements on responsible custody and diversity. But neither seems to engage very candidly with the free market economy in which we operate. The free market that makes it possible for some institutions to spend millions to purchase a celebrity archive, but which at the same time constrains our ability to take care of those archives after the ink on the press release has dried. While I believe our codes of ethics could use a nudge here and there, I'm not sure that the solution is one that can be codified. What I might offer in closing then this morning is an invocation. I ask you to think hard about where we place value, and more importantly, where we don't place value. To be ethical stewards of culture, we have to ask ourselves this question each day and know that the answer might change each time. Thank you.
I want to thank each of our speakers this morning for some interesting case studies with a number of differences, but also some commonalities that I hope we can begin to explore. Beginning with an obvious difference, we've got a case of a jointly owned archive, and we've got a case of an archive in Guatemala, but a digital surrogate here at UT. And then we've got a case of a tussle over an archive and the migration of an archive from one coast to the other. I'm curious if our panelists could say something about the researcher experience and how researchers have been impacted by the different arrangements that you each described.
Well, each institution has digital copies of the LLILAS. So at the moment, they're in Marbach in Germany. If somebody wants to look at the originals, they would go there. But we have digital facsimiles in Oxford that they could see. I mean, those particular letters had, again, been on deposit or loan with us for some years. So there was some new material added in as part of the sale, but for the large part, they were known.
Yeah. Okay.
I think people tend to forget that Columbia still has a significant Allen Ginsberg collection. I think that it's true that HRC has Ginsberg materials, and many institutions do. But I think the publicity around Stanford's acquisition, and of course they do hold the main archive at this point, probably gives a false impression of completeness. But the collection is regularly consulted still. Nonetheless, I think researchers make it work.
Yeah. And Theresa, in your case, it's a different kind of research community. It's not your traditional researcher, I suppose, but family members and others seeking answers to important questions.
Yeah, it's both and. Certainly, for family members, for prosecutors preparing cases, visas and travel funds are not easy to come by. So having those here would make them inaccessible to one of their primary audiences. And I think, given the nature of those records, the fact that they document horrific, traumatic events, having the AHPN staff able to provide some level of care and support for researchers coming in to access the question, to look for information on their loved ones, and they can support that audience in a way that we can't and aren't really set up to do. At the same time, we have been able to support some really exciting and interesting ways for academic researchers to be able to engage with the collection. Shortly after the digital platform was launched, our current director, Dr. Virginia Garrard, was able to build a graduate research seminar had Guatemalan heritage. Some of them felt a really deep connection to that collection, and it was being able to bring it into the classroom, but also bridge that gap between an academic environment and the Guatemalan context. I think was a really rich way to that material.
I'm curious, in these two scenarios where there's a digital component, if I'm seeing the needle move on that notion of equivalence, the digital surrogate carrying more and more weight as a viable surrogate for the original.
I think in Kafka's case, it's a utilitarian solution. I think there's still this sense of awe and of importance that attaches to the artifact.
Again, yeah, it depends a little bit. We have done our best to replicate the structure and the function of the physical archive. However, for use in judicial cases, prosecutors still need to go to the physical archive and have the archive seal on the records to be able to submit them as evidence. We can't provide that service. On the other hand, given how large this collection is, there are all kinds of new ways to engage with it that are opened up by digital scholarship tools and ability to process the collection as big data. There was some research released a year ago that did a statistical analysis of how the police, what euphemisms they used to refer to deaths in custody. And so they were able to do some machine learning on the language to identify those trends and patterns. And it's not something that can easily be done manually. So yes and no.
Okay, so opening up some new research questions that could be posed of this digital resource.
I mean, the question of the digital is really, it is an interesting one because, of course, these sorts of institutions want to define themselves according to what they have physically, who they can bring in. Of course, you can't do that with the digital. So in a way, the digital has offers wonderful opportunities for partnership and sharing, but I think it's also thrown some sort of focus, for better or worse, back on the idea of material culture and the idea of uniqueness, and certainly the rate at which academic teaching around and involving objects and archives has accelerated through their sort of physical presence and qualities, I think indicates that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Again, in a couple of these scenarios, what we're hearing describes collaboration with an international partner, whether it's the AHPN or the DLA. And Chris, you briefly alluded to that relationship with the phrase "not entirely easy." But I'd like you to go a little further and understand tremendous benefits as well. But can you tell us more about the specific challenges or the specific benefit of the collaboration, the programmatic activity, obviously?
I mean, I think the challenges are really, as I said, on the practical side. The material. There was a decision that we weren't going to split off, 50% of it to be in Oxford, 50% to be in Marbach. That didn't make any sense. So its default location is actually Marbach. We can call it back if we want for exhibitions. But the fact is that it's an indivisibly owned collection which can only be in one physical space at any one time. As any institution that lends or moves materials of this kind of importance and value around knows, there's a great deal of work that goes on in relation to that. Transport, insurance, so on and so forth. But I think, as I said, those challenges are, in a way, nothing when compared to the possibility that actually the materials may have disappeared, been dispersed, and not accessible in the context of a major research library, whether in Germany or in Oxford?
I think probably some of our, the logistics have been a huge challenge, and working through the bureaucratic systems that are put in place for how we can transfer money, how we set up institutional arrangements, have probably been the biggest challenges that we've faced, and that's more on our end. But I think we've also, our work has been deeply enriched by these partnerships. The collection materials we're able to provide access to are richer than they would be if we curated them. For instance, another collaboration we work with, another partner we work with in Guatemala, digitized a collection of press clippings documenting these same years at the height of the violence and kind of the intensification of violence during that time. We would have never asked them to, and we certainly do not have the capacity to read every article and extract every name, but for them, that was the most important thing. People want to know what happened to their family members. And so they did, thousands of articles, every single name of a victim. And that has provided an incredible research resource.
Do either of you see the arrangement that you've worked out with this international partner as setting a precedent for future initiatives?
Well, actually, we did do it again, and this time even more controversially with Cambridge. Who would have thought? Some Geniza fragments from the Cairo Geniza, which we jointly digitized and brought back together. It is not my preferred model, I have to say, but it's been very interesting to see that in extremis it can work.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just over the last year or two brought on 3 new partners that we're working with in Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, and we're looking forward to be able to bring more partners on in the future. I think each collaboration, we learn something new, we grow in a new way, and yeah, it's been an amazing opportunity to work in this way.
So what I'm hearing is also a question about resource and capacity to sustain this work. And Shaun, you made some reference to the market in your presentation. I've always assumed myself that the buyer, and maybe this is somewhat crass, but the buyer who can pay the most is demonstrating the depth of commitment in some crude way. If we're not basing acquisition questions solely on the market, what principles should be guiding where a collection belongs? If we're considering rival claims, legal proceedings, and human rights issues, what kind of criteria might replace market considerations?
I was struck by the something that you said about collections being how we define themselves, which is, of course, has been historically true. And Theresa, your remarks, which actually indicate that we are defined through the activities that we perform around a particular collection. And so, to sort of answer that question, I think there are any number of ways. I think that the process of these can be brought to bear on the process of acquisition. So we, as I'm sure many of you do, routinely calculate the cost of stewardship. How much does it cost to store, to process a collection? And then if we're talking about a sale, use that in the negotiation. I think that simply is sort of best practice. But we also talk about the very things that you've discussed about what we would be contributing both to the Columbia community and to the student experience, the audience that may exist on campus or beyond, or even in New York City. So I think that increasingly we are sort of moving away from sort of defining ourselves through collections to activities. I think we have to be sort of active agents in that process. Sometimes it's sort of intrinsic to the type of collection we're talking about, whether it's, say, a literary celebrity like Kafka or Ginsberg, or whether it's a human rights archive. But a lot of it has to do with the decisions that we make each day, and how we choose to talk about our collections, both to each other and to the public.
One of the other principles, not really a principle, but one of the other factors that has sometimes guided the placement of collections is the presence in an institution of a prominent scholar or community of scholars. And Theresa, you alluded to UT's strengths in that area, but I'm curious your experience with those kinds of criteria in determining the movement and the placement of collections.
I think you're trying to get us in trouble.
I think we all want to try and think about how to shape collections for the future and sort of pick up on trends. But I think, as Shaun said, the reality is a lot of the time we're responding to opportunities, academic enthusiasm, zeal shown by students for particular types of materials, and often that's what we have to go on. There are a lot of collections out there. There are a lot of items in the trade, sales catalogues coming at us the whole time. You have to try to collect strategically and intelligently and to think about what you already have, of course, build on strengths, but then, of course, there's always a wish to fill gaps, to have examples of things you don't have. But I think certainly in my experience, having very strong academic advocacy and a sense that collections that you acquire and are going to invest resource in are going to be used and used quickly and effectively is a really important factor. We want to see these things being used, being appreciated, and forming part of the scholarly landscape and the teaching landscape.
And I gather, Theresa, in your experience, this acquisition has partly followed some scholarly and teaching strength that's here at UT, but there's also a flip side in that it's enabled scholarship and teaching and other programmatic work. And in my own experience, it's that institutional DNA that persists beyond the individual faculty member who, let's confess, is often an itinerant faculty member. It's that institutional DNA that can often be very determinative in these kinds of decisions and very fruitful if we're building with that long view, I think.
Very quickly, I draw a fairly clear line between people and programs, and so this is why I was afraid I might get into trouble. I would be hesitant to acquire any collection for a single faculty member, allowing for the fact that sometimes the distinction between a faculty member as a person and a program can be blurry. Generally speaking, sustained programmatic support is much more convincing.
We have been very lucky to have a number of faculty members as well as some graduate students who have been strong advocates of these collaborations, who have been deeply invested in them and have helped us build the trust and communication we need to make these collaborations successful. Honestly, we couldn't do what we do without their role facilitating communication, but also envisioning the life of these collections beyond a single digitization project. And that has been bringing it into the classrooms and building coursework around it. It's been conducting research into specific themes, but they have every step of the way been essential collaborators for us, and we've been very fortunate in those that we've worked with.
Very good. Why don't we open this up to audience questions? And I know there's some that you have on your mind. We're going to have microphones, I believe, in the aisles. And if you would, wait till you have a microphone before addressing the panel.
I actually have a number of questions, but I'll stick to one. I'm Jane Klinger from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. And my question is, and I'm terrible with names, so please forgive me if I call you by a name that is not yours, but Teresa. Is that correct? Yay. We have made some similar efforts, many much earlier on during the era of microfilm and microfiche, starting with that. I am just wondering if there were any models for your program and which ones you used.
Yeah, I mean, I think we continue to learn.
Your mic's not working. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can't say at the beginning. I came in after a lot of this work had started. The AHPN partnership was already well developed by the time I joined LLILAS Benson, so I don't know about what role models the initial projects drew on. I do know, I think there was some initial conversations with the Holocaust Museum. I know we have a close relationship with Witness. And we've continued to try and learn from and engage with like-minded projects, with projects that are looking for new ways of engaging with partners and collaborators, and more equitable, horizontal dynamics between partners. I don't think we're all the way there. I think we still have a lot to learn and new ways to grow and more things, new ways to work. And I'm really excited to see growth in the number of community-based projects, in collaborative work between universities and community archives and human rights archives. There's some really exciting things happening, and the more we all engage with each other, I think we'll all come out with richer, more dynamic collections and collaborations as we look to the future. So, sorry. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mary Goolsby, and I'm at the Baylor University Collections of Political Materials. The criteria that we normally use with congressional archives or senatorial archives is they go to the state, somewhere within the state where the person served. We have a number of collections that, small collections that were donated to us with other things. And in one instance, I have personal letters of a congressman, and that's all I have. But I know that there is another place here in Texas that has the rest of his papers. So ethically, where do I stand with that? There's a part of me that really feels like I should work with that institution and say, you know, these letters really belong with the rest of the collection, and we didn't have to pay for them, and it's not a huge collection. So it's, it's maybe 20, 25 letters. So I guess I'm going to bring up the concept of repatriating those and giving them back to that collection so that they can all be in the same place. And so I'd like to get some feedback on that, because that's I have a couple of things where I really feel like we didn't really pay for them, so we don't have money out, and they're not huge collections, but I'd like to give them back so that they can go back and be with the collections that they belong with.
Sure, Shaun?
I would endorse that route with a couple of words of advice. one, you might do due diligence in making sure that the institution to which you're transferring these is capable of caring for them. And secondly, and this is something that if you'd given us 15 instead of 12 minutes, I might have brought up, which is I've been thinking about documentation for the last couple of days, the importance of documentation. So documenting your decision to do that is absolutely critical. In the same way that in the context of my talk or any acquisition, I've come to think that those questions that we have to ask ourselves every day, we need to document how we answer them. At Columbia, we've taken to writing fairly thorough market justifications every time we make a purchase now. And I think by documenting those justifications, we can also sort of resist the kind of inherently conservative nature of the market. This is sort of veering away from your question, but the theme here is really to my advice is to proceed due diligence and document the decision. So.
And I would just add, here at the Ransom Center, we are part of the UT system, and so transfers within UT system institutions can be supported. It's not a deaccessioning activity. It's simply an institutional movement to another UT system school. So we've done some of that here, and in fact have a present case where we're making such a transfer to the Briscoe Center for American History here on campus for many of the reasons that you're citing. So it's not unheard of. It's not unprecedented. It is difficult, and I would echo Shaun's point about documenting those decisions. Other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Stephen Urice from the University of Miami School of Law. I have a brief question for both Teresa and Shaun, so let me just ask both of them perhaps at the same time. Teresa, you had commented about the fear of potential destruction of the archives, and that fear and that possibility being a reason for the necessity of digitization. And yet you then spoke about the control of what gets digitized, how it gets digitized, access to the digitized materials as appropriately remaining in Guatemala. And I guess that there's a tension there that I don't quite understand. And if you could perhaps explain that. And Shaun, you made the comment that it was not unethical for Ginsberg to have sold to Stanford. My question is, could you address the ethics of Ginsberg's having allowed Columbia University to invest assets over years without then providing notification of his intentions? Thank you.
So, I mean, I think to a large extent we see that the duplicate digital copy of the files that we hold is kind of a dissuasive counterbalance. It's not a cut and done, like we can't guarantee that some action won't be taken against the archive, that those records won't be destroyed. But there's a much less compelling reason to do it if you know that doesn't actually destroy the collection. Those records remain available, usable, and accessible. But the questions of what things to digitize, how to digitize them, how to describe them, I truly believe that rests with our partners to determine. I have a lot of, I have a strong background that, I worked in Guatemala in the human rights sector. I have an academic background studying Latin American history, and particularly this era of the post-conflict and transition in Guatemala. But I am not Guatemalan. I do not live this day in and day out. There are decisions around this collection that I am not the right person to make, particularly around access and the potential harms that it may have for that community. That rests with the people who have to live it every day. Yeah.
And your question for me was about the ethics of accepting the deposit to begin with, is that right?
Not so much the ethics of the deposit, but you were speaking of Ginsberg. Thank you. You made the statement that it was not unethical for Ginsberg to have sold to Stanford. So my question was, are there ethical implications of his having placed them on deposit, of your having accepted them, and no remuneration then being made to the charitable dollars that Columbia spent during that period of deposit?
Okay. Well, I think that would have been a lot of trouble to pursue. So I think on the ethics of deposits, I think like most institutions, we will say that we have a policy that we don't accept deposits. But like most institutions, there will be situations in which prominent alumnus come to you asking to accept a deposit, and you want to say, we don't do that. So I mean, I've come to feel that where we, I think, drop the ball, again, is in documentation. There's no signed agreement detailing the nature of that deposit. As far as I'm concerned, term deposit agreements that have a clear path to ownership and are signed and mutually agreed upon, I can live with. But no such document existed in this instance. I didn't see any effort to even check in after the 10-year stipulated in that memo to see if a permanent transfer was ready. And as to sort of any kind of potential sort of compensation for the effort that we put into tending to it, I mean, this all predated me, and there may be others who know how well, say, organized the Ginsberg Collection was when it was at Columbia. I can certainly say that it took, as I said, it took an awful lot of my predecessor's time. But I don't think. I think because of how explicit Ginsberg was at the outset about his intent, it's very hard for me to see us making a case that he should have, cut us in on the deal or something as a way to sort of compensate us for effectively acting as a sort of secretary for 25 years. So.
We have a question in the middle.
Hi, I'm Amy Armstrong, and I have a question for Shaun and Christopher, and maybe Dr. Enniss as well. And I look forward to the other sessions that are going to delve into this question more broadly and deeply. But when you're discussing acquisitions, and you mentioned several criteria for informing that decision, one thing you mentioned is building on your collection strengths. And I would like to know how an institution goes about doing that to reflect more diverse and diverse communities and individuals, and not simply perpetuating, the business as usual, basically white males that we all know that are well represented in our collection. So how do you go about building that diversity while still building on your collecting strengths?
Do you want to go first?
It's good. It's a good question. I think I would define our strength very broadly. So, political papers, literary papers, so on and so forth. And so to try to within those broad categories to try to collect in a representative way. The question of striking out into completely new collecting areas is an interesting one, and I think institutions like ours need also to pay attention to who else is collecting in particular areas, and not to try to go after everything or compete with institutions who may already have built up particular types of collections. And who wish to continue to do so. I think the other interesting thing here for me is the collections that an organization already owns, which may be able to answer new kind of research queries or interests in new kind of cultural or research areas, the way in which those institutions catalogue and present the materials they already have is really important. And I think sometimes the way organizations catalogue or have traditionally catalogued kind of militates against actually pointing out the diversity in those collections. So it's partly about how you shine a light into what you already have, in addition to looking for new collecting areas. We catalogued for many years using the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as our a sort of a key tool. That, of course, tends to list great people and dead people. And so if you're only using those in your indexing terms, you're missing out a lot that may also be in your archival collection.
I think it's a great question, and Steve, something you said in your introduction, I think you said stated it very, very well. The kind of the long tail, if you will, the sort of weight of kind of institutional momentum that does shape our decision making. That's certainly something that we face at Columbia. We are beginning to work more with, say, our Global Studies division. Now, whether or not, which effectively means the Global South. So in and of itself, the fact that that's a distinct unit from everything else seems problematic to me. But now, at the same time, one of the challenges that we have faced, that I'm sure many of you have faced, is that you just have way more than you can responsibly steward. And if we are compelled to build upon existing strengths, which to some extent we do, then how do you make sure that you carve out the space and opportunity to expand the scope of your collecting? I mean, as Chris was saying, I mean, it can be done within we have 8 curators at Columbia, and there's no reason that our literature curator cannot define literature broadly enough to be more inclusive, or that our comics and cartoons curator can't do the same thing. Might be a little harder with our medieval and Renaissance manuscripts collecting, but we have certainly aimed to do that. But every day I feel that kind of the weight of that institutional momentum kind of pushing against it, how we can sort of responsibly bring in collections that are more inclusive. And I'm thinking especially of some of like the Global South collections that are brought to our attention, which often come with like real preservation concerns. I feel like I've been having a conversation about mold on a daily basis for 6 months now, and it's frustrating that often those collections that we want to be able to bring in that would make us more inclusive seem to be facing challenges, stewardship challenges greater than those that we maybe collected 100 years ago.
Amy, thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and I'd like to weigh in as well. I think collecting to collection strengths is a criteria, but it can't be the only criteria. Otherwise, we are simply perpetuating the inherent biases that are present in these legacy collections. So I don't think there's anything inappropriate about collecting to collection strengths unless it's solely defining all of your collecting activity. I agree with what's been said that one can define your collecting area broadly enough, your collecting strength area broadly enough for more diverse collections to be acquired under that umbrella. And I think to take our modern literary collections, for example, here at the Ransom Center, there are tremendous opportunities for expanding the nature of those collections in a more diverse and mindfully more diverse way. Even when we do that, we're in a building with 34 million, roughly, manuscripts, and it would take decades and decades for the character of the overall collection to be fundamentally changed. And so I think what one can do as a step, not the only step, but something I'm very interested in is, which Chris alludes to in cataloging practices, thinking in different ways about how we reveal and expose the diversity of the collections that are here. Or look to, in this case, the Ransom Center's own backlog and potentially even prioritize underrepresented figures or communities in our existing backlog that may not have been cataloged in a past time because it was perceived as outside of a main collecting strength. I think there are a range of professional practices that we can deploy today to begin addressing this fundamental inequity. Conversations like this are helpful, and I think in addition to our professional activities of cataloging and processing, we can also change the character of the institution in our programming. Programs like this one, programs like what we offer throughout the year. And so I think there are near-term things that one can do to give voice to those who haven't historically had voice. And I would agree entirely with what I think was the premise of your question, that one can't exclusively, or one shouldn't, I would say, exclusively collect to collecting strengths. Otherwise, you're simply perpetuating those biases. Thank you for that question. Other questions? Chris, the Kafka situation, that was the family that proposed, the estate that proposed that. It wasn't something that you came up with yourself. Is that right?
They decided they wanted to sell.
Okay.
And we responded.
Okay, so it came from, how did the collaboration come together?
They have, the DLA has amazingly important material. We did. We got talking. It seemed to make sense.
Okay. I think there's more in the file on this one.
What's the time?
Yes, a question over here on the right.
So do we share in conservation treatment, stewardship, so on and so forth? Yeah, neither party would do anything to those manuscripts without the agreement of the other. And that extends to protocols for couriering the material, so on and so forth. Yeah. It's in pretty good condition.
And here in the front, if you'd wait for the microphone, Jose.
Thank you. Christopher, I read some time ago that in England maybe it wasn't all that popular, the fact that some important collections from British writers, mostly poets and playwrights, had been acquired by the Ransom Center. So my question is about national pride and whether you would be able to take off the hat of librarian at the Bodleian and think as a British citizen, does it, what do you think about those global collections, globally, or institutions that collect globally? Do you think if you were not a librarian at the Bodleian, you would think differently? You would think, I wish this collections remained in England?
It doesn't always just work that way round. We recently acquired the wonderful archive of Leonard Baskin's Gehenna Press, great American artist and bookmaker. So there was Philip Larkin, great librarian, pretty good poet, made a big
Terrible
fuss
person.
in the 60s and 70s about what he called the neglected responsibility, which was British institutions not making enough effort to keep their contemporary literary heritage. And then you would get these sort of perennial stories in the press about, Tom Stoppard's come here, or Ted Hughes has gone to Emory, also Steve, before he came here. And the whole thing sort of became tit for tat, kind of knockabout journalese. It frustrated me, and I think what frustrated me the most was the perception that actually British institutions hadn't been active or didn't have the means to be active in this sort of collecting area, which just perpetuated the myth. And I think a number of writers probably sort of thought that and went to US institutions, maybe without thinking about British institutions first. But, I've long admired what this institution does. It started collecting contemporary papers with an alacrity and a zeal before British institutions did. And I think if a writer wants their papers to come to a particular institution, then it's up to those writers to make that decision. There's quite a lot, in all honesty, to go around. So I think, sure, I mean, all of us, we wouldn't be in this game if we didn't occasionally think, such and such an institution's just acquired that collection, it would have been wonderful for us to have that. On the other hand, as you see from this discussion, we're all pals. I think we all appreciate what each other are doing in terms of building up their collections, and basically I'm okay with it.
And on that, I think we have pretty much run out of our time, and we're going to have a 15-minute break, but I'd ask that we give our panelists a round of applause and that... And I would ask that you be back promptly at 11 o'clock when our next panel will begin. Thank you all.